All right. Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much. Well, exciting news. I look forward to seeing everyone Sunday that can be. And we, of course, understand if you can't be, you don't feel comfortable with the situation at hand. That's understandable. But if you can and want to be in our midst, we would love to have your fellowship and enjoy being encouraged one with another in person. It's not to say that this technology is not great. We appreciate it and wants to continue to use it. But it is to say that seeing face to face is a wonderful sense of encouragement. And so we look forward to those that can and those that are able and feel comfortable with the situation being together next Sunday. But until that point in time, let's study a portion of God's Word. If you have your Bibles with you, turn to John chapter 8 this evening. We're going to look at a passage there for the time in our study together this evening. Back a few years ago, you might recall there was a movement in the world, really. It was WWJD. It was what would Jesus do? There were bracelets made, and there were necklaces made, and there were books that were written, and there were sermons preached, and there were videos that were made, and it all centered around the question, what would Jesus do? And it came to be known as the WWJD movement. Well, so many times we ask ourselves that, or at least I do, maybe you don't, but I do. I ask myself that in certain situations and with certain things going on. And one of the things back that I've always wondered is, well, what would Jesus do when he came into contact with and talked to folks that were not believers or folks that didn't follow the same belief that he had? Or, as we might call it, how did he act when he came into contact with sinners? That's a question that I think we need to look at and we need to consider. When we stop and think about the fact that in the world today that there are only 34% of the population of the world that identifies themselves as Christian. And then when you look at that, and there's no further breakdown that I have, but if you look at that, the number of individuals that say are active Christians, there are a lot of folks that will say, well, I'm a Christian in the United States, but I'm not an acting, or I've had them say I'm a professing Christian, but I'm not an acting Christian. And so the numbers would get even less, if you will. But how does Jesus, how does he deal with people like that? What would he do if he came into contact with people that were not Christians or not following even the law, the Jewish law at the time in which he was alive here upon the earth? Well, I think we have a great answer for that in John the 8th chapter. You might recall the story there. Jesus is teaching, and Jesus is teaching in the temple. And there are those that want to, of course, capture Jesus at a vulnerable time, and hopefully he would say or do something that would violate the law, and then they could prove that he was not the Messiah, and he was not the prophet that was promised. He was not the one that he said that he was. And so constantly there were those that were attacking Jesus. Well, Jesus is in the temple. He is teaching, and there's certain of the scribes and Pharisees that bring this woman that has been caught in adultery, and they bring her in, and they basically tell Jesus, now, teacher, we want to know. Now, teacher, you see, they're buttering him up. Teacher, rabbi, we want to know something. This woman, as they profess, that was caught in adultery, the very act, the law of Moses tells us that she should be stoned. But what do you say? And they thought that they proverbially had him. But notice that the text says they were testing him. They wanted to see really what he would say. And they wanted to see what he would do. And so Jesus, as he kneels down, is writing in the dirt or in the dust. And he continues to write, but they continue to hammer him with questions. What are you going to do? What are you going to say? What should we do? What do you want done with this woman? And so finally, Jesus looks up And he asked, he who is without sin among you, let him throw the stone at her first. And then he stooped down and he began to write in the dirt again. Now there's always been a question, well, what was he writing in the dirt? We have no way of knowing. Text doesn't tell us. And it really is not important. But when the individuals heard Jesus' statement that he is without sin, let him cast the stone first at her, they began to go away. Notice that verse 9 says they were convicted in conscience, and they began to go away one by one, from the oldest even to the last, until Jesus was alone with the woman. Jesus then raised up. The text reads almost as if Jesus had so buried his head into the ground that he didn't see what was going on. Now, I don't know if that's exactly right or not. The text just seems to indicate that. But Jesus rises up from writing in the ground, and as he does, he notices, it says that he saw no one. So he asked the woman, he says, woman, he says, where's your accusers? Where are those that have pointed a finger at you? He says, has no one condemned you? And she says, well, no one. And so Jesus said, well, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Jesus was rubbing elbows, if you will, with a sinner. But what did Jesus do? How did he react? How did he act? Now, let's notice something before we move further. And that is that, as we said, this was probably all, if you will, perpetrated upon the idea of let's catch Jesus in a quandary. Because according to the law, which they wanted Jesus to interpret, they did not bring the woman and the man. They did not bring the two eyewitnesses. And all of them together were to make the case. That's how in the book of Leviticus the law was written. They just bring the woman. But in bringing the woman, notice some of the things that Jesus did and did not do. The first thing that we notice, or one of the first things that seems to jump out at me, is that Jesus never downplayed the sinfulness of the woman's actions. Jesus never said, well, she's all right. You know, we live in a day and age of tolerance, don't we? Let's tolerate. And we're being called upon to tolerate anything and everything. That it really doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter what you believe. It's almost as if everything is relative. That there is, as we talked about last week, there is no absolute truth. We try to justify ourselves. You know, when Jesus taught the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself in Luke 10, there were those that came to Jesus, certain one especially, and he says, well, who's my neighbor? But notice in Luke 10:29, it says, and he, in an attempt or wanting to justify himself, said, who is my neighbor? And then Jesus taught the story of the Good Samaritan. There are those that try to rationalize their behavior. There are those that wink at saying, well, it's all right. And it's all right because so-and-so's doing it. And it's all right because this one's doing it. Got a man years ago who stood out in the foyer of a church building and for years had talked about a particular event being wrong. He had talked about abortion being wrong. And then one Sunday, all of a sudden, out of the blue, he said, as the men were talking, he made the statement, he says, but there are times in which you sometimes change your opinion. And he walked into the auditorium without saying another word. And one of the other men looked at me and he says, well, what's that all about? He's really changed. He was always outspoken on the issue. Well, there are things then that in a few weeks came to my attention, as I was told by him and his wife. And I understood, okay, now I understand why he made the statement. I don't agree with it. I believe abortion to be wrong. But nevertheless, I understand why he made that statement for himself. You see, we began then, because of situations in our life, to tolerate things. Well, maybe I wouldn't do it, but it's all right that you've done it. Isaiah the prophet in Isaiah chapter 5 talked about those that were false prophets and those that were teaching things that were not true. And he says, woe, and the word woe there is pronouncement of judgment. Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, and bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Isaiah says, these individuals that are changing the truth to fit their own needs, to fit their own teaching, to fit their unbelief, that these that are willing to compromise their convictions. Isaiah says, woe to them. There's pronouncement of judgment upon them. We're to continue in the faith, grounded and settled, Paul wrote in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 23. Jesus did not compromise what he believed to be right and what he believed to be wrong. Jesus never said, well, what she's doing is not that bad. Or there are others that are doing the same thing, or there are others that are doing worse. Jesus never downplayed the sinfulness of the woman so as to compromise his beliefs, his actions. Story is told during the Civil War of a man that put the northern pants on and put the southern top on and went out in the middle of the battlefield only to be shot by both sides. We have to understand that there is a right and wrong. There is not, if you will, sometimes where we can kind of wink at sin and say it's all right. Jesus didn't wink at her sin. Jesus never downplayed her sinfulness. But then there's a second point that could be made here, and that is that Jesus encouraged the accusers to first look at themselves. Jesus wanted the accusers to look at themselves and to see what they had done. Notice that Jesus, as he looked up, he said, let him who is without sin cast the stone first at her. Well, that caused folks then to look at a little bit inward. We don't really like to look inward, and very few of us really do look inward. Now, we look outward and we look at the other fellow and we point fingers at the other fellow and we say, oh, look what he's doing and look how he's acting and look at the mistakes that he's made. But the Bible reminds us that we need to examine ourselves, 2 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 5, to see whether we're in the faith. We don't need to do this comparison to other individuals. Paul himself in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12 reminded us that we don't need to look at, and he makes the statement, he says, we dare not compare ourselves, or we dare not class it or compare ourselves to them that commend themselves, but they, measuring themselves by themselves and commending themselves by themselves, or comparing themselves by themselves, is not wise. Paul says we don't class, we don't commend ourselves to those that compare themselves by themselves. Paul says, look, fellow that's just looking at himself and trying to compare himself with others. And yet I've had individuals say, well, I'm not as bad as so-and-so. And when they say that, I lovingly have to remind them, but we're not talking about them. We're talking about your situation. Jesus here, this lady that was not what she should have been, Jesus wanted her accusers. And some might say, well, then that means that really none of us should bring a charge against another. Well, it is true that in Matthew chapter 7, Jesus said, judge not that you be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you should be judged, and with what measure you meet, you should be measured. But let us understand that the judgment there that Jesus is talking about in the Sermon on the Mount is a harsh, censorious type of judgment upon which one is exacting every detail of every point, even matters of opinion, and finding fault with others when they're not in agreement with them. And so Jesus says, you be careful how you're judging people, because when you start judging on those areas, that's how you're going to be judged as well. Jesus is not saying there in Matthew 7, you can't acknowledge the sin in folks' lives. And it's not to say that, well, since I'm a sinner, I can't point out the sins in other folks' life. It's not to say that at all. But it is to say that we need to be individuals that walk in love. That's what Paul reminds us in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1. That we're to walk in love, and we're to walk in love one towards another. We're to help the fallen brother, James 5. We're to bear one another's burdens, Galatians 6. And we're to help each individual in an attempt to go to heaven. That's our responsibility. That's our charge. That's what God would have us to do. But at the same time, too, we must understand that folks will come back at us and say, well, you sin as well. You're right. I make mistakes. And for those, I try to repent. And for those, I try to correct them. But let's straighten you out at this point in time. Jesus, though, reminds us that when we begin to point a finger at someone else, there's three others on the hand that are pointing back, really in many ways four. The thumb points out to the side almost as if to point at us. And so we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful what we do and how we live our life. Let us not forget to do good and to share, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased, Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 16. And so we must look at ourselves. Before we begin to throw stones at others, we must look at ourselves, knowing, yes, that we are sinners, but understanding that we're trying as best we possibly can. But then thirdly, notice that Jesus treated the woman with great compassion. Compassion can be defined as sympathetic pity, concern for the suffering and the misfortunes of others. That's how Webster defines compassion. Compassion is seeing the needs of others and being willing to act in order to help them in their problems. Jesus often was moved with compassion. When Jesus fed both the 5,000 in the book of Matthew and the 4,000 in the book of Mark, the 8th chapter, Jesus, the text will tell us, was moved with compassion. These folks need something to eat. These are not the only times. When Jesus saw the widow of Nain and saw her grieving the loss of her child, Jesus, it says, was moved with compassion. Jesus was moved with compassion when there were those that were brought to him. And we have seen recently, on Wednesday night in our studies in the book of Mark, we have seen where Jesus was moved with compassion towards people and towards the circumstances of their life. Jesus treated this woman with compassion. Now, the Bible reminds us that we're to be second-mile Christians, right? And we're to treat folks with the golden rule. Whosoever compels you to go with him a mile, go with him two. Remember Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount? But right before he taught that, what did he teach? He says, whatever you would that men should do to you, do you even so to them likewise. Jesus reminded us in that what's called the golden rule by so many. Jesus reminds us and reminded us that we're to be Christians that treat folks as Christians should treat folks. That we are to let brotherly love continue, Hebrews 13 and verse 1. But we have to remember that the admonition to love and to love one another is not just confined and defined by just loving Christians. That Christians are to love everyone. And Christians are to treat others with love and compassion. I may not agree with them. I may not see eye to eye with them. I may not agree with their decisions. I may not agree with the lifestyle that they're living. But I still treat them with respect. I still treat them with compassion. Most of you, if all of you don't know, that for a year, while Suzanne was trying to finish up so that she could retire, I worked in a factory. I worked in industry in Dixon. I was treated very well. I loved the people on my team. They were very respectful of me knowing who I was and what I was about. I talked to them. I didn't talk much about the Bible with them because I had promised those that hired me that I would not create trouble and there would not be Bible studies and long Bible discussions on the floor. But I will say this, that I learned to love those people. And I believe truly by the plaque that hangs in my office that they gave me, that they loved and appreciated me. I didn't sit in condemnation of them. I tried to love them and tried to show them what living the Christian life was all about. And I think they understood. I hope they understood when I walked out of there on March the 17th of this year, that they understood what I was trying to do. Dear friends, it's easy to walk up to somebody and just really tear into them because of what they believe or what they don't believe. It's easy to walk up to them and tear into them because of what they're doing and how they're acting. Jesus didn't tear into this woman. She knew that she was violating the law. Jesus, though, did not, if you will, as the young people say, rip her a new one. In other words, he didn't just sit there and just tell her off. But he dealt with her lovingly and tenderly and kind. Fred Craddock is an interesting man. Years ago, Fred was not a member of the church, but his family was. His father didn't go to church and didn't make Fred go to church, and he claimed that Christians weren't what they were supposed to be. But Fred, he married a woman that was a good Christian lady. There were a lot of preachers through the years that would come to their house, and they would encourage Fred to come to church. And when there was a gospel meeting, a lot of times the preacher for the gospel meeting would come, and he would talk to Fred, and he would talk to him about coming to church one night during the gospel meeting. And Fred's constant answer was this: "Oh, all you preachers are the same. All you're worried about is another nose to count and some more money in the collection plate." And this went on for years through several preachers. Oh, how his wife prayed for him, and she got others to pray for him, and she got others to talk to him. And anybody that talked to him, Fred would just say, "Y'all just want another nose to count and more money in the contribution. That's all you want." One day, Fred had to go to the emergency room. He got sick all of a sudden. When he was rushed in, he had an emergency surgery, and he came out of the surgery. He had been out of it for quite a while due to the illness that he had and due to the operation, the anesthesia that he went under. But Fred nevertheless woke up. And when he woke up, he looked around the room. He saw around the room flowers, cards, a lot of them. And they were all from church members, just wishing him well, just hoping that he would get better and that he would get better soon. Fred was too weak to talk. And when he saw the various gifts, he took a pencil and he wrote on the side of the tissue box a statement from the play Hamlet. And he wrote this statement: "In this harsh world, draw your breath in pain to tell my story." And so his son said, "Well, Dad, what is your story?" The father took out a pencil and he said, "Tell them all that I was wrong." Where did he come to that conclusion, and why did he come to that conclusion? I believe because these folks had treated him with great compassion. Jesus treated this woman with compassion, and so should we treat all those that do not believe as we believe. But then fourthly, Jesus called upon this woman to change her life. You might say, I don't see that. Look in verse 11 again. Notice what Jesus said: "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Jesus, yes, he did not downplay her sinfulness, nor did he condone her sinfulness. And even in his acts of compassion, he's not saying, "Well, what you're doing is all right." He told her, go live your life, but don't live it in a sinning manner. Do not practice sin. Jesus was not dismissive, nor was he condoning the sin. The call that came to this lady really from Christ was to count the cost. And in counting the cost, know that she's going to have to deny herself and take up her cross. She's going to have to surrender her life to the Lord and not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of her minds and prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. She was going to have to die to self, as Paul wrote in Colossians chapter 3. Put off these things, and he talks about putting to death the members which are upon the earth, and he talks about several different sins there. Jesus is telling this woman the same thing. Dear friends, I still believe that while we don't sit and just tear people up for their wrongdoings, I also believe, though, that we have to understand sin is still sin. And sin cannot be dismissed as being all right. But we as Christians need to tell folks, don't live a life of sin. Come to God. Be a New Testament child of God. And in being a New Testament child of God, come out of the old life and the old way of doing things. Paul would write to the church at Thessalonica, and this was a church that Paul loved. And as Paul would talk about how great they were in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, he would talk about in verse 9, he says, "For they themselves declare concerning us what manner of entry we had to you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living God." You see, Jesus, if you stop and think about it, didn't tell this woman, well, you just keep doing what you're doing and you'll be all right. Oh, no. He said, sin no more. And that would have been enough for this woman to have understood that according to the law, she was practicing sin. And so Jesus says, don't do it again. Don't keep sinning. Get out of it. And yet there are some that don't do that, if you will. They don't get out of it. But Paul reminds us in Romans the 6th chapter, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. That expression, God forbid, is in the Greek text in the what's called the optative mood. Now, you may have not studied Greek, and you may not know what optative mood is, and that's fine, good. Nothing wrong with that. But that mood there, that tense there, is a very strong, intense tense. And so when Paul says, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? That expression, God forbid, could be put this way: by no means, not at all, no way. And so Jesus is telling this lady the very same thing. Don't practice that sin. Stories told of a man that every time he led a public prayer in worship service, that he would call upon God to clean the cobwebs out of each member's life. There was one man that just got very tired of this man saying that in his prayers. And so one Sunday, this man was to pray, and he prayed as usual, and he prayed, Lord, clean out all the cobwebs in our lives. To which the member that was tired of hearing that, when the man closed his prayer out and said, and Lord, kill all the spiders as well. Well, I think you get the point, or I hope you get the point. The point is this: let's be sure that we're dealing with folks. We don't condone their sin in our acting with compassion towards them, in being loving towards them. We don't go about and say, well, you're all right. You just keep doing what you're doing. Let's be sure that they understand that we're still against sin and we're still against what's wrong. So how do you deal with folks that don't believe like you believe? Well, I think we learn from Jesus. I think we can learn that we don't downplay the sinfulness in their life. We do look at ourselves, and as we look at ourselves, we treat these individuals with compassion, knowing that we still need to call them to repentance. Cornelius taught us this great lesson, didn't he, in Acts chapter 10? Of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he who fears him and works righteousness shall be accepted of him. Dear friends, let us be those individuals that practice righteousness. And let us share that very teaching with others, that we as individuals must all practice righteousness, living the way God would have us to live. It's not easy. It's not easy living in this world, is it? And it's not easy knowing everything to do and always acting the way we're supposed to act. It's not. I can't tell you that it is. But I can tell you that as a Christian, we learn a lot from Jesus about how to deal with those folks that are not like us. I hope that this will help you, and I hope that it has helped you. I hope that you'll be loving and kind towards folks. You'll show them the path, both through Scripture and through your own life, of how they need to live their life. If I can help you in any way in that service, I'll be glad to talk with you. I'll be glad to render my service to you to help you in that, so that we can help others and teach others the truth. We hope that you have a great week. I hope that everything goes well for you this week. We love you, and we're constantly in prayer for you, and I'm sure you're praying for us. But until we meet again, and that will be Wednesday night over this same service, may God bless you and keep you is my prayer.